watching the whole screen later, asynchronously, we'll just have a series of blank spaces. Similarly, Carol, if you could just stop everybody's video other than mine, obviously. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great. Still just a few of you with microphones on. Can I just ask you, thanks, Rachel, just to mute. There's a lot of us on here and people still coming, and I'm delighted to say we got colleagues from all over England, from Wales, and rather remarkably in the middle of the morning in Australia. We send you our best wishes, especially those of you in Melbourne going through difficult times. So this is the last in the series of webinars and for the summer, and we'll be starting again in the new school year. I'm just now going to share my screen and get that sorted, and then we will see that. Is that okay? Splendid. Carol, can I just get you to close your video as well? Leave your audio on so that if I needed just to check with you, I can do that.
Okay.
Just at the bottom of the screen for you. You see the stop video? Don't worry if it's not there. Do you see the stop video on the bar at the bottom, Carol, of your screen? That's great. Thank you. So,
Wait, it took a while.
Don't worry. Sincere welcome to you all. Let me just minimize that. Have lost the ability to use a capital letter with this word beginning with a small r and then a large E, but that's quite deliberate, as I hope you'll see as we go through the session together. I'm going to share with you some things that I think we know from research about how people deal with change. And I'm going to draw on a book I wrote a decade ago called Revolution, and you'll see why it's Revolution, How to Thrive in Crazy Times. I hope you'll agree with me that the times have rarely been crazier than right now. I want to acknowledge and thank our funders, the Common O Foundation, and all of you, especially from schools that are part of the Expansive Education Network. And big welcome if you've simply found a spare hour in your busy diary and have logged on through Twitter or through some other mechanism. There you can see the two Twitter addresses that might be of interest, my own and the Twitter address that relates to a series of books that we've written about how you can shift the way you think about teaching and learning to bring about more expansive outcomes. So today's session is going to focus in a developmental line from where we left off last time, where we were talking about zest for learning and how we might engage with schools outside or organizations outside school. Today's going to be at least as much for you because it's going to be focusing on change and what we know about it, and if we know about it, what we might do about it. And although of course there's an implication that everything we do here will have a relevance to our students, our pupils, also this is very much spoken and written with you in mind. I want to offer 8 statements, rules, if you like, things that we know about change. I want to explore each, and I want at the end of each of those explorations to suggest something that we might do differently as a consequence of knowing these 8 things. Here they are. I'm going to sometimes pick out things that might be relevant to you, sometimes things that might be relevant to your life as a teacher, the students you work with. And I'm going to move at the end towards a suggestion that if you like this approach, and especially if you like one of the slides where I explore the flow of emotions that we all go through when faced with change, whether you might like to turn any uncertainty you may have into action research next term when you're back in school. So the shape of it is me talking through those 8 rules. I'm just going to ask, there's one person still with their sound on. If you might be kind enough to turn that off now, because there's some background noise just for the recording. Thank you. Who would have guessed it, that rather than having classrooms full of students, we were engaged with our tape measures and the 2-meter ruler to see exactly how few people we can get into a space we thought we knew well. None of us, I think, could possibly have predicted that. We might have predicted that we'd be doing something a little bit like we're doing now, but not necessarily as the norm, whether it's Teams or Zoom or Google or any of the many different ways in which we might be communicating with our students. If you haven't found this or come across this yet, can I commend Learning from Lockdown, a website that Peter Hyman and the Big Education Group have set up, which is full of very thoughtful blogs from thinkers and researchers and principals and teachers and parents and students themselves. I've contributed something to this about the kind of things that we were talking about in an earlier webinar. I'm saying this to you because I think one of the bits of learning from lockdown when we are in a period of enforced change is just to consider how much of the changes that we're kind of forced to do now are good, are bad, to consider which of them are, in the great scheme of things, significant or actually quite minor, to think about those which have a personal dimension, those which have more of a cultural, social dimension, and most fundamentally, to think about those which are desired and those which are perhaps not desired or even resisted. I now want to start then with rule number 1. Change is changing. That may seem a silly thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. And I'm going to go back to more than 50 years ago, the futurologist Alvin Toffler, who was talking in pre-internet days, was talking about how the force of change was so enormous, so great, that it had almost changed our sense of time. I wonder if some of us just at the moment feel occasionally just a little bit like that. The classic view of change is this one, and many of you will be familiar with it. It's Everett Rogers thinking about the way innovations happen with a particular agricultural interest. How do new innovations get taken up? And the curve that you'll recognize there is a bell curve, and it assumes rather nicely and neatly that a small number of us get interested, and then more, and then much more, and then it rolls down the hill the other side very neatly. You can see how this thinking is influencing the way we're thinking about the pandemic that we're in at the moment, can't you? And I'm hoping that this graphic image will immediately be making you wonder, well, that's not how I think it is. Look at what's just happened in Leicester. Look at what's just happening in different parts of the world where, having apparently flattened the curve is, as it were, increasing again. And the model I want to offer you of change is not Everett Rogers, but is Malcolm Gladwell's, a synthesis of ideas about how change happens. He uses a very nice idea, an idea of a tipping point, which interestingly he takes from the metaphor of a flu epidemic, rather pertinent to where we are at the moment. And he uses the example of the New York Underground as how in a remarkably short time, from being a rather unsafe place with heavily graffitied rolling stock, it not overnight, but very, very quickly changed. And he identifies what he calls the elements of the elements that go to make a tipping point. And a tipping point is a very different image from that bell curve. It's of a relatively slow, gradual increase of interest or awareness, and then a sudden tipping point. And I think that's really what we've experienced in the medical sense and societal sense as we've been in the COVID-19 period that we're all in right now. And the points that Malcolm Gladwell makes about tipping points are that they are very contagious. Well, that's obvious if we're talking about COVID, but in terms of ideas, they catch on very easily. He also says that small causes have very large effects. The small cause in the story of the New York Underground was the simple decision to remove all graffiti within hours as a strong symbol that the underground was safe again. We care about it, and therefore we care about you. And the third element he noted about all this is that it can be very sudden. So why am I introducing you to something vaguely theoretical about change and how it operates? Well, because I want to suggest a first take-home idea, and that is that change is an abstract noun. And whilst we're thinking about it in the abstract, it kind of rather does depend how we conceptualize it. And how we conceptualize it, if we neaten it up, assuming that it will be like a bell curve, then we may feel particularly upset if we have to go back into lockdown, or if we've got used to teaching in one way in the new normal of online, and we have to go back or go forward into a more blended solution, and so forth. And the lovely reminder here is of a general piece of advice from Reinhold Niebuhr about the way in which you spend your energy on those things that you think you can change, and don't, or try to accept with some serenity, the things that you think you can't change. And of course, the wisdom to see the difference between the two. So if we were to take our first take-home point from this, it would be, I think, as we reflect on this extraordinarily turbulent period that we're in at the moment, it will be worth us remembering and holding our courage to the sticking point to change the things that we really believe that we can change, and of course that we think are the right things to change. So change is an abstract. It really does matter how we visualize it, how we picture it, how we conceptualize it, but also it's often seen as something that happens out there. You only have to turn on the news every night to see that it's kind of seen as something out there. But actually, real change, as the psychologist William Bridges reminds us, is within us. It isn't the changes that do you in, it's the transitions. And whilst change is external, transition is internal. It's the process we go through to come to terms with a new situation. In fact, evolutionarily, and here's where I get the idea of revolution. So evolution, the concept of Charles Darwin, is the idea that over a relatively long period of time, the species evolves and adapts. So it's a concept of gradual responsive change. I'm wondering, hence the title Revolution, what the slightly faster change that we're experiencing and have been arguably for the last 30 years, what's that doing to the way we think about life, to our habits of mind, and to the way we interact with other people? Well, evolutionarily, change or novelty was a cause potentially of danger. And because of that, our brains evolved the fight or flight mechanism. The idea that we either had to trigger adrenaline so that we could run away or climb rapidly to get out of the way of an aggressor, or to, in another way, trigger our energies to attack them or indeed to defend ourselves. And this flow of emotions and feelings is pretty similar to that moment we might have had when confronted with a dangerous adversary many thousands of years ago on the steppes. If you are familiar with loss and how we react to loss, you will probably recognize this as a set of feelings that many of us go through when something really seriously upsetting happens to us. At first, we're angry at it, and then perhaps we're in denial that it's even happened. So much so that we can, as it were, stick our head in the sands. And then gradually we're becoming aware until we say, okay, yeah, I accept that I'm not sadly going to be able to say goodbye to my year 11s or my year 13s or my year 6s in the way that I would traditionally have done. So then you're in a state of mind when you get to reluctant experimentation where you're starting to come out of your anger and frustration and denial and beginning to look up and out and think about how you might survive and then eventually thrive. And the key transition point there is reluctant experimentation through to willing trial. I'm going to ask you to think at this stage about the things that you might already be thinking for next term that you might want to try out, and just hang on to them because they might fuel an idea for you to do some of your action research next term. Another way of looking about change is one that was created by Kurt Lewin, and it's the idea that change requires us to unfreeze. If that block on the left is a block of ice, even, to unfreeze and therefore to become water, and then to refreeze in a different shape. In this case, we've still got the same water, but the molecules are organized in a different way. His image reminds us that when we're thinking about ourselves, we're the same person. It's just that some things within us have changed in some kind of way. I find that really helpful. I find the freeze and unfreeze and refreeze idea really helpful because it's, of course, it's the scary bit in the middle, isn't it? That often is difficult for us to get our heads round. So what might we take home from this? Well, I think the most obvious thing to say is that when anybody's going through something that's hard, like that chart I showed you just a few slides ago, moving from anger to willing acceptance, then to talk out your feelings at each stage is helpful. And to acknowledge that even reluctant experiments are a good start. And so my take home for this is that even if you feel, which one would be very empathic towards you if you are, that the world as you know it educationally and indeed in your wider world has kind of come to a grinding halt or a challenging halt, then even making small tests of change, small experiments, even kind of with gritted teeth, is a good place to start. Once upon a time, if you took your car to the M25, you had to obey the national speed limit. And people who studied traffic movement began to notice that, paradoxically, if you had a variable speed limit and you were able, because of the crossbars over the signposts over the carriageways, to signal that now we were in a 30 or 50 or 60 or 40, you could manage the flow so that, interestingly, it was actually faster than if you went stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. It isn't quite the metaphor I want to use here, but it's not a million miles away. I want to suggest that one of the things that we can do is when we're confronted with really challenging change is to think differently. And it's the concept that Ellen Langer explores in her wonderful book, The Power of Mindful Learning. And she says there are three aspects of mindfulness. It may be that your school, if you're from a school, or if you're a parent, maybe you're just interested in this, or if you're watching from another organization, already interested in mindfulness. And there are lots of different approaches, but here are three helpful things that Ellen Langer reminds us of. It's about not getting stuck in a category, by which I mean, and Edward de Bono says nice things about this too, when he talks about, don't think about what's good and bad, think about what is good, what is bad, and what is interesting. So it's keeping a fluidity of category so that you don't say that's bad or that's good without allowing yourself to see the subtleties in between. To maintain an awareness of others' perspectives around you so that you're able to not just within, but without, to shift the way you relate and to maintain an openness to new information. So a take home here might be, well, obviously being is rather important, and breathing deeply is rather important. But particularly here, I think just trying to avoid the sense that everything has to be put in a category called that's really good for education, or that's really bad, or that's really helpful for my home life, or that's really awful for my home life, and so forth. You probably know this cartoon. It's the tragedy of the commons. It's the idea that somehow there are some of us who perpetually are at one end of a boat, imagining that we're going to be unaffected by the hole that is gradually letting in water at the other end of our boat. In other words, those of us who like to see things that go wrong as somebody else's fault. Oh, I should have given you an alert there, which is please look away if you don't wish to see a naked woman at a window. I apologize if I've upset anybody. Look away now. Here she is, a naked woman at a window. One of the images that Guy Claxton and I use in a book of ours called The Creative Thinking Plan, written for the BBC and about 10 years ago now. And of course, looking at that, you'll begin to see that I'm having you on, aren't I? There is no woman at that window. There's a cat, and there's a shelf, and there's a pot plant, and there's a curtain, and there's a wine glass, and there's underwear. There's no woman at the window. There just seems to be a woman at the window. Why on earth am I showing you this then? Well, I'm showing this to you because I think it suggests to us how very quickly we get set on the way we see things. If I asked you now to see not the woman at the window, but a series of shapes, you probably could do it, but you'd find it difficult. If I'd set this experiment up differently, and you might like to try this with your class or with your partner or with your family, by saying, can you see this? Can you see the cat? Thank you. Can you see the pot plant? And if I did it that way, oh, and by the way, can you see if you stand back that looks like a woman? That might indeed be the way you saw it. Let me try something else on you now. This is something from the book, from Revolution, How to Thrive in Crazy Times. You probably know this old chestnut, don't you? Any one of us who's a parent will have had a child come interestingly and excitedly towards us, trying to catch us out, because the classic answer to this question is an answer to which is longer. Well, they're both the same, except that in this slightly cunning version, they're not both the same. The bottom one is palpably longer. Now, you may be one of a very small number of people who noticed that. Brilliant if you did. But if you didn't, like many of us, then you've simply demonstrated another truth about change. And that is that it's very, very difficult to unlearn things. And especially when they've had a bit of an emotional impact, like being tricked, we tend to remember that. And we simply put that in the, well, that's the answer to that question, isn't it? All of these are relevant to our final few slides tonight, which will be about action research and the questions that we might like to ask of our own practice. Let me try another way of approaching this theme, which is that we can change the way that we see the world. Here is an example of a set of thinking that emanates from positive psychology, from Peterson and Seligman, and is known as your explanatory style. It's how you account for things when they go wrong. Let me imagine that in this case, your photocopier has gone wrong. Of course, it happens to all of us. It happens to all of us, especially when we're in a hurry and running late and all those good things. Or possibly we haven't filled the toner up recently, or the paper's got damp, or whatever it is. So the 3 Ps of learned optimism are along these ideas of permanence, personalization, and pervasiveness. And they describe 2 versions of a story that we might tell ourselves when something happens to us, hence explanatory style, how we might explain something that happens to us. In this case, we might say if the paper jams. Typical. Things like that always go wrong for me. Or even just things like that, photocopiers always go wrong, as if there's a permanent element of photocopiers and they always let me down. So over time, permanence. Or we might personalize it and we say something to ourselves, typically like typical. It's always me that the photocopier breaks down for. Or it might be, if in another part of our life, that we're bemoaning that it's always us that gets picked on by the head teacher to do something. Or if we're thinking about a home situation, it's always us that gets asked to do the washing up or the chore or whatever it is. Ultimately, that can be a bit of a kind of victim thing, can't it? And a very unhelpful way of seeing the way things happen to us. Possibly the most corrosive and the most challenging in a learning sense is pervasiveness. Pervasiveness, if this were a photocopier example, would be the photocopier's gone wrong. And it's not just the photocopier that's gone wrong. My whole life is imploding. The school's closing. My partner's leaving me. The bank's sending me horrible, and so forth. And you move from one particular example in your life to another category. Categories in the way that we see things are so important. In a school sense, you can see this often, can't you, when a child has an unhappy experience in one class and then brings that with her or brings that with him to the next class they go to. That's an example of pervasiveness. So there are ways of framing stuff that happens to us that resist that. So we hear the voice that it's gone wrong, but we don't think photocopiers always go wrong. We think, what do I need to do to make sure that this time it's got all the things it needs to work properly? We don't think, oh, that's the photocopier against me. We think, well, that's just one of those things, and I'm not the only one that's unhappy because I can't photocopy the whatever I need for my class. And pervasiveness, really importantly, we put a kind of barrier in between something that happens in one bit of our life and something that happens in another bit of our life. For those of us in a teaching sense, this is really important, isn't it? So that we try and deal with something in the context where it happens, and if possible, not take it home. It's difficult, and the take-home idea here would be to remain optimistic. We need to change the scripts that we use in our own head. It's like sort of thinking about yourself as having a coach on your shoulder, able to help you to reframe a situation that happens for you. Well, those of us who were around when this happened will remember Apollo 13 and probably remember Jim Lovell and his famous message, Houston, we have a problem. And the problem was, of course, an explosion, and the explosion leading to near catastrophe, and everything about the journey then being about how safely this group of men could land back on Earth in the ocean, which indeed they did, by showing the most creative extremes of adaptive intelligence, of changing the use of one thing to make it fit for purpose for another. That has a learning resonance, I think, and that resonance, or the antidote of that, I think, is potentially Homer Simpson and his fixity of purpose. And in terms of us as teachers and learners and parents and those working with schools, probably it cues Carol Dweck's and Angela Duckworth's work and David Perkins' work and a number of academics reminding us of the purpose and point and power of mindset, and of a particular kind of mindset, a growth mindset. So that on the one hand, we can think like Homer Simpson, and we can see everything that goes wrong for us as a bad thing. We can be averse to effort. We can constantly be comparing ourselves to others. And on the other hand, thinking more about mistakes as our friends, that sweating something out is a really good thing to do, and the cultivation of tenacity and resilience and being collaborative and open a really important and powerful part of the way we deal with change. In terms of the message of growth mindset for dealing with crazy times and change, I think that one thing we might take into our classroom and take into our own life is the idea that, again, it's a script moment, a bit like the inner script of becoming more optimistic. It's really catching ourselves when we say we can't do something and replacing it with we can't yet or not yet do something. Really important, powerful ideas, these. If you were in the Middle Ages, then you might be one of a small band of people known as alchemists, believing wrongly that you could turn even base metal into gold. In other words, that you could make anything change. Of course, it was completely wrong, but it was an interesting and is an interesting idea. The fact is that although you can take a horse to water, you can't make it drink. And although you can kind of make it, you can incentivize change, you can't ultimately force people to change, or not at least in a decent civilization. A bit like Spot the dog in this cartoon. In a teaching sense, you can teach something to someone, but notice the second frame, I can't hear him whistling. I said I had taught him to whistle, not that he'd learned. There's a huge difference between what we tell people or teach people even, and from what they listen to and what they do as a consequence of that. One interesting bit of research here comes from psychologist Robert Zahonk and his idea of the mere exposure effect. Zahonk showed that merely by being exposed to something, you get to like it. Now, forgive me if you're a fan of 60s wallpaper, but I'm going to make no judgments about this. Think of anything that you might find in a new home or a new flat, which makes you think aloud or speak aloud. Goodness me, that's got to go. I don't like that. Well, this effect, this mere exposure effect, shows us that actually, when you are gradually exposed to something, far from it becoming less attractive, it over time becomes more attractive. So you can almost imagine yourself a month or so later talking to somebody else and saying, you know what, that wallpaper, it's beginning to grow on me. And that it's beginning to grow on me. Remember that, because that's going to be really important when we think about return to schools and the things that we might do there. So take home idea here, that far from the proverb, familiarity breeds content, not contempt. So how can we create environments in which we ourselves and our teachers and our students and our parents can safely become exposed to something with the hope appropriately that it might be something they'd like to take on and give and try. Sometimes, as the Luddites showed, it at least seemed to be smart to resist. Smashing industrial machinery was an understandable, if ultimately Luddite and unhelpful way of dealing with innovation. George Bernard Shaw at the turn of the century humorously reminds us that reasonable people adapt themselves to the world and unreasonable people attempt to adapt the world to themselves. Therefore, all progress depends on unreasonable people. Nice, perhaps, if you're a school leader watching this thinking, well, who are the unreasonable people I always have to deal with, and what might I do just to bring them round to giving this a go? There's a really interesting formula from David Gleischer, not well known for much except this formula, which is helpful when thinking about making it easier for people to overcome their resistance to change. And it looks like this. It's a piece of algebra. D stands for dissatisfaction, times V stands for vision, times F, first steps, is greater than R, stands for resistance. And it means that when we can articulate our dissatisfaction with something and at the same time articulate our vision for a better world and at the same time offer practical first steps for reaching that vision, then we're more likely to overcome our own and other people's resistance. Think about anything you've ever been part of or anything perhaps that you've led. And I'd like to think you'd see the relevance of this. So if, for example, I'm at the moment thinking very carefully about the disadvantage of GCSE as it currently exists, and I'm able to give rein to my dissatisfaction by ruining the fact that it focuses on single discipline, that it seems to privilege some disciplines over others, that its predominant method of examination seems to be recall rather than application, and so forth. I could go on. Now, if I'm trying to persuade you to join my view here, I'll need to be able to paint a picture of a world in which assessment isn't per se bad, but a vision in which assessment serves our ends as educators. And I might draw an assessment for learning, or I might remind you that GCSEs only are a hangover from the past when school finished at 16, and now remind us that our goals are to have young men and women in formal education, either in school or apprenticeships, colleges, right through to 19. I paint a vision of what that is, and then I offer some simple first steps as to how you might try portfolio assessment, or how you might try gallery critique, or the invitation to outsiders who are experts to come and give feedback to your students, and so forth. All of those, by the way, are real examples. So take-home idea 7 is, whenever we're talking about something that requires change and we're hoping to bring people along with us, or even hoping to persuade ourselves, it's really helpful if we can articulate, without being rude and over emotional, what's not right with the status quo, that's the dissatisfaction, where we'd like to be, that's the vision and the V, and what practical first steps we might have to get there. So into the home straight then. Of course, so much of school is a solo pursuit. Back to the exam example, almost entirely testing individuals rather than groups. Whereas in life, as employers tell us, we want young people and then older people who can collaborate with others in a learning and in a broader societal sense. There's a really important principle here, I think, and it is the reciprocity principle, as these two zebras are demonstrating. You scratch my back and I'll scratch mine. There's a good psychological literature, by the way, as to why that works, but not time to go into it right now. So my plea here to all of us is quite simply to think outside ourselves, to think of all of our networks, to take time out to give generous critical friendship to others, because just as you might, as it were, scratch somebody else's back, so too they will be more motivated to scratch yours. So as you think about the end of this term, and as you think about the next term, if you're coming at this from a school perspective, who else do you know who might help you in whatever it is you want to do in your school life? And if you weren't able to see the Zest for Learning webinar, do have a look on the Expansive Education Network site, and you'll see some examples, some practical examples from there. So I said I was going to share 8 things that I think there's some good evidence about with regard to change. Here they are again. They come from this book. And if you've not bought your lockdown reading, then a sales alert, do please feel free to get one. It was rather well received. It won the Management Book of the Year for Innovation in 2010, so 10 years ago. Partly as a gentle wind up to myself, I added a 9th rule, which was rule 9, make up your own rules, because I don't know about you, but I tend to react badly to too many people giving me rules as to what I should or should not do. Carol, I just noticed we've got 4 people trying to get in, so if you're able still to admit people, that would be wonderful. If not, quite understand. Back to the Kurt Lewin 3-stage process, because I'm going to use Lewin in a moment because he's arguably the father or the creator of action research. But the key thing he was reminding us about was the scariness of the transition in crazy times, in any change. And here was the feelings of enforced change curve or flow that I gave you. And here's the reminder of where I think we need to get to, somewhere between guarded acceptance. I accept that we may not have a vaccine until 2021 at the earliest, and therefore I'm going to, albeit reluctantly to begin with, I'm going to give X a go, give Y a go, try Z, whatever it might be. So I want to conclude now with a few thoughts about action research, what it is, how it works, and I want unashamedly to try and persuade you to give it a go. I'd love you to come and join us on the Expansive Education Network site, and there you'll see examples of some of the schools. Some of the schools are on this call, some of the great pieces of research they've been undertaking. Action research is normally attributed to Kurt Lewin, but there are a family of different people in the States and in the UK who have contributed to our understanding of this. And essentially, it's about practitioners improving their practice through inquiry that involves others. It's an iterative process of noticing something that you're not quite happy with, planning something, noticing how it works out, adjusting, and so forth, as in that circle on the right. It's really important that as part of that, we gather data. It enables us to tell a story. In much of what I've been doing today, I've often been sharing little mini stories, which are part of a way of communicating what's going on. It's not an external researcher coming to your classroom. It's you on the bridge of your own ship. It's you undertaking your own research. And it's not a large scale, it's a small scale intervention. There aren't control groups, but it is rigorous because it's possible to have data from many different sources other than just your own perceptions. At the Expansive Education Network, we use a very simple funnel model. We invite, and I'm now doing this with you. If you think about this as a piece of creative visualization, where are you coming from here? What's your stimulus? What is it you're keen to do? What's your hunch? What do you think might be going on here? What have you read, research about this? Who have you spoken to who's doing interesting things? And how might you frame a question? I'll come on to how we do that. And does it fit with your school priorities, which are going to change, aren't they? Every school is going to have a slightly different priority next year, given the crazy times we're in right now. And then settling on an intervention, a small test of change, something that you're going to try out maybe over a term with a selected class or part of a class. And then how might you evaluate what you do? And we suggest that you frame questions in this way. If I do something, will something happen? And we suggest that you start with the will something happen? And the typical something happens might be children will be more resilient, or my learners will be better able to collaborate with others, or my colleagues will be better able to deal with change, and so forth. And then from that, you work back and think about what your intervention might be. Now we're nearly there, and in a moment we're going to open up to a very brief conversation, albeit slightly stilted because of the Zoom factor, but we'll give it a go. If you're watching this now and thinking, yeah, I like that, then hold that thought. Just think in the autumn term, what might I like to see differently in my school? And allow yourself the luxury to read around that subject, talk to other colleagues, and then think, so what might I do to bring it about? What might my X be to bring that about? Of course, it's all impossible. You can't do this. There's no use trying, Alice laughed. She said, one can't believe impossible things. I dare say you haven't had much practice, said the Queen. When I was younger, I always did it for half an hour a day. Sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. I urge you, 130 years after Lewis Carroll's wonderful book Through the Looking Glass, to think about the impossible things that you might do. And if you're stuck for reading material, a prompt of some of the things that might help you. And if you haven't had a chance to explore our Expansive Education site, there's the URL. If you're on Twitter, then there are a couple of Twitter addresses you might like to note. And if any of this has stimulated you, either positively or negatively, I'm really pleased to receive your emails and chat with you and understand more about where you're coming from. So let me stop now sharing my screen, and let me welcome you back and invite anybody who wants to, quite understand if you don't, to make yourself visible. Absolutely okay if you either don't want to or don't want us to see the extraordinary scenes of joy happening beside you in your family context, whatever it is. But if you want to, do. And then in a moment, I'm going to ask anybody either using one of the reaction symbols to indicate they'd like to say something, or I'll just open my chat box and see if I can see anybody who wants to. There's nothing there particularly that's relevant here. Oh, 2 new messages. If there's something that, yes, you will receive the recordings. Whoever's just put that in, we'll send that to you. And I'm now going to look back across my 3 screens worth and go to Peter, who's very kindly raising his virtual hand. Hello, Peter.
Hello, Bill. You talk about reluctant experimentation. I would think joyous experimentation. And I once worked with a lady who'd done training in Unilever, and she found that there was a lot of fear about doing innovation in some ways. And what she found was the way that really got people going were 2 things: trust and excitement. And the manager who said, "You're safe. Whatever you say, we want to hear it. We encourage you, express yourself. You know, you're safe. There's no comeback. We love hearing the impossible. You know, we love hearing your thing." And making people excited. And that worked really well. And it was sort of strength through joy that, you know, once you realize that actually having to do something was an opportunity.
I love that, Peter. I so agree with you. The only reason I have the reluctant word is there because as one comes out of grief and anger, sometimes there's an initial reluctance, but I couldn't agree more. Creating the ecosystem, the culture for joyful experimentation. And it's not a million miles away from Carol Dweck's thinking either. We see experimentation as what makes us human. We see, therefore, mistakes as the things that we all make and learn from, rather than something that we have to see as a negative. We appreciate. I mean, I think the lens of much of this is appreciative inquiry, not gap analysis. I totally agree with you. A lovely idea. Thank you so much. I'm going to look at my screen again and see if there's anybody virtually or actually waving at me. Absolutely no problem if you've simply hopefully enjoyed it but had enough and want to get on with the rest of your life. Paul, welcome.
Hi. Hi, Bill. Thank you. That was really interesting. And I was just wondering, thinking about the current situation, and personally struggling a little bit with all of the being told what to do all of the time. And I was just wondering, you talked at the beginning about change and the fast pace of change. And in leadership, does that perhaps create difficulties? So I wonder whether we're going through a period where there's a lot of authoritarianism or a temptation to authoritarianism. And is that possibly a result of the fast pace of change, that people in positions of leadership simply can't cope with the fast pace of change, and so they're just getting used to saying yes or no and being very rigid about it?
That's a big question with all sorts of wonderful societal question marks hanging over it. So just a few thoughts, and then, by all means, if others want to join in, do. I mean, I think we're in a bind here at the moment, because on the one hand, the libertarian in me doesn't want to be told. That's why I don't really like rules, if I'm honest. Doesn't want to be told to do anything. On the other hand, I can see the greater good argument as you're in the middle of a pandemic, that I actually equally, I want to be told, but I want to be told as a grown-up, and I really want to understand why this makes sense and why it's in other people's interest for me personally to do that. So some kind of constraint, I think, is really good. In terms of the speed of it, in the very brief overview or 3 strands of mindfulness I was suggesting, I think there is undoubtedly a need for processing time. And equally undoubtedly, there are only so many things the human mind can process at any one stage. So there's something about the almost inevitable conflict between being in a fast-moving period and needing the processing time. I think I guess I'm talking as much as a parent as an educator here, that sometimes I think we need to give our friends and students and colleagues permission not to try and change everything. I think it can become a terrible burden if you believe you've got to solve all of these problems, and that's a bit the kind of the Niebuhr quotation about kind of judiciously knowing where to put your shoulder against the wheel of change and where not to it. And I think also there's something in one of the earlier take homes about talking these things out. It's at the moment, I think a lot of individuals, whether they're adults or young people, notwithstanding Zoom and Facebook and Twitter and TikTok, all the kind of things we can do, are actually quite isolated. And I think some personality types are feeling this more difficult, with greater difficulty than others. So I don't think I've got anything terribly profound to say, Paul, other than just empathizing and agreeing with you that speed and the amount and speed is really challenging. But how would you answer your question? What would your thought be, Paul?
Well, I think it is, but I mean, I was thinking perhaps more broadly. I mean, I think this pandemic and the crisis has brought it to a bit of a head, where I suppose you see maybe the politicians. I mean, I empathise with them. I understand the difficulty of their situation, but you know, they follow a very simple line in explaining what the science is, rather than maybe investigating things a bit more or explaining the investigations. But I think even sort of building up to this, yeah, I think yes, the internet, emails, and the fast pace of life has left less room for leaders to reflect on making good decisions.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point of the science, my colleague and friend Guy Claxon was a professor of the learning sciences, and I've always thought of science in the plural, and it seems to me we're using a number of different sciences, and once you put the definite article in front of it and make it a singular,
yes,
it seems a bit of a prop rather
yes.
than what we might hope our politicians to be using. Great question, and thanks for that remark, Paul. We've got a chance for a couple of others if anybody would like to. I'm just going to scan my screen again to see if anybody's wanting to say something or contribute, or just in the chat. Oh my goodness, and I've just seen a colleague in Sydney, Australia. That's wonderful. Great to have you on the call, and great to engage with you. Looking just across again, probably the last chance now for anybody to say, I'd like to say something, and just unmute yourself if you would. So I'm going to do a 3, 2, 1.
Hi, Bill. Yeah, I've left a question, not a question really, on the chat. I didn't understand when you explained. Thank you, actually. It's very, very interesting and very helpful to kind of try and prepare for September. But there are 3, you explained, there was a slide, but my daughter was screaming, so I moved away from the screen. There was one thing about personalization.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, you come back on that a little bit, because
of course. So this was something called explanatory style, and it's a way of helping us understand how the different ways in which we make sense of things that happen to us. In other words, what is our default, if you like, or what is our natural way of making sense of stuff that happens for us. It's particularly relevant when we don't want the stuff that's happened to have happened to us. So I was using the light-hearted but hopefully safe example of a photocopier that doesn't work properly, and I was framing it as, these are not my P's, 3 P's of personalization, permanence, and pervasiveness. And the personalization is about when stuff goes wrong. So if we were in the current situation, in the lockdown situation, you might be, if you were in negative, pessimistic personalization, you'd be saying something in your head like, typical, this kind of thing is really affecting families like me adversely. Now, you may well have reason for that. You might be a single parent or caring for others in your family, or really in a very difficult, disadvantaged situation, or in a very small and constrained space, whatever. Those may or may not be the case. But if your default is to assume that the pandemic is somehow against you, as opposed to just something that's happened, that can be very corrosive. And the opposite, of course, is to say, you know what, we're all in this together. I'm feeling pretty bad at the moment, but I'm not the only one who's feeling pretty bad. The second P is permanence, which you can hear sometimes in the worries that some young people are expressing, you know, because time maybe seems rather different. So they might be thinking, my school's never going to open again. Or this is awful. This is going to be awful. This has ruined my school life forever. And there would be considerable empathy for that perspective and considerable understanding for that. But if you just see this as a phenomenon of over time forever, then it makes you more dependent and less likely to say, I'll try this or I'll try that. And the third of the three is pervasiveness. When, I don't know, in the current situation, Carol was talking earlier on about there was a storm and, you know, her internet had failed. If you took that line, that example, so mini story, you know, your internet fails. And so every system that comes into your house, automatically you assume is going to fail. And that's something that is particularly evident with children with special needs. I noticed classes where a really tough lesson in one class, they can take that experience of not getting something into the next class and the next class, and that can be very destructive. So the situation there, the reframing is, well, you know, I really did struggle in that context, but now I'm me, and I know I'm actually quite good at English, or I'm quite good on the sports field, whatever it is. Now I'm in a different context. So that's what you missed when your daughter was doing things. Hope that helps. Last chance, just looking
Thank
around.
you.
My pleasure. Either unmute yourself or show yourself, or both, if you want to say anything just before we close.
Good afternoon, Bill.
Hi there.
Bill Lucas. Just a quick call, just a quick talk. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you so much for your webinar and your conferences and your chats. I found them extremely interesting. It was just one of the things that I was not quite clear on, and that was the equation. Dissatisfaction, vision, versus resistance. So what was the F?
First step. It's a bit clunky. So
first steps.
The idea is, if you're trying to overcome resistance to change, especially if you're the leader, so a school leader, let's just imagine you're a school leader and you're trying to take the school in a particular direction, and some of your colleagues are resisting your change. Then the first thing, the D thing, is that you need calmly, where possible, drawing on research, to say, I believe this isn't right because. So I was using GCSE as an example. I believe personally that any exam system that is predicated on failing a third of those who enter it is not a good thing.
Okay.
So that would be my statement of dissatisfaction. My vision would be a world in which formative assessment for learning, really rigorous feedback from teachers to kids and other experts to kids took place. My first steps would be, here's a practical tool that you could use in your classroom tomorrow. And then I would hope that by going through that, I'd had some chance of overcoming people's resistance. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for clarifying that for me.
My pleasure. We
Much
have reached
appreciated.
our allotted time. I'm delighted to see that the recording button is still glowing red, which means that my colleague Carol will be able to, thank you for the clapping as well. We'll be able to put this up on the Expansive Education Network site. If you've not yet had a chance to have a look, please do. Once again, our thanks to our friends and supporters, Commono Foundation, who enable us to do this kind of thing for free. And a big thank you to all of you out there who are, in whatever way you're contributing to the expansive education of our children. Thank you. So bye-bye from now, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much.